DevilNeverCry.
In today's video, Square Enix finally weigh in on the turn-based versus real-time debate, and they take us through some of Final Fantasy XVI's toughest challenges during its development. Thanks to a new interview conducted by Square Enix themselves, featuring Naoki Yoshida, Hiroshi Minagawa, and Koji Fox, the producer, art director, and localization director for Final Fantasy XVI respectively, we have a whole new host of information and insight regarding Final Fantasy XVI and its development. The interview starts out with a question that a lot of people are likely wondering, and that is, how exactly did Creative Business Unit 3, aka the team behind Final Fantasy XVI, even arrive on the concept scene in Final Fantasy XVI? To which Naoki Yoshida, the producer, answers that after having spent so much time in the creation of Final Fantasy XIV and having the opportunity to speak with so many players and journalists and media around the world, he essentially wanted to create a game that would appeal to a broader audience, in a sense that it would appeal to gamers from a variety of different generations. People who've played Final Fantasy before, people who have never played Final Fantasy before, never heard of the series, people who are young and just starting out as gamers, to those who have put their time in the trenches, so to speak. And as a result of those conversations, they decided to go ahead and create an action-based game that aims to tell a more mature story than other counterparts. The follow-up question to that is just as critical, and it is a point of contention in Final Fantasy fans and amongst the community, in that you only play as Clive Rossfield, and what exactly was the decision behind making him the only playable character? After all, RPGs are known for having a wealth of a cast to include in your party. To which the answer to that essentially boils down to the answer that was in the first question, which is they did this because they wanted to ensure that players who aren't confident with action games whatsoever would be able to still enjoy the game. That's why they didn't want to opt for a complicated and complex control scheme, or some sort of combat system that involved switching between multiple characters in real time, such as the one seen in Final Fantasy VII Remake. Judging by this answer and previous answers we've seen in other interviews, Square do want this to appeal to a wider audience, and they want a lot of people who aren't Final Fantasy fans to dive into the series, specifically with Final Fantasy XVI. With that said, however, just because certain aspects of the combat might be simple, it doesn't necessarily mean that they lack depth. Yoshida-san goes on to reiterate once more that Clive is very customizable, and that is something that I myself have seen in my hands-on previews with the game, but also in a lot of the marketing material, where Clive is able to essentially equip multiple different types of iconic abilities, allowing you to mix and match them at will, allowing you to create your own build or version of Clive that will better suit your playstyle. Skipping ahead just a little bit, we come to the section where they discuss the Hideaway, which serves as the main hub for Final Fantasy XVI, despite it of course not being open world. Minagawa-san goes on to clarify that creating the visuals for the Hideaway was one of the toughest aspects of it, as the performance tuning for the area took a long time. This essentially only happened because they initially created the Hideaway as a really intricate location that the player could explore, and during the development they didn't necessarily stop to think about the processing load that this would put upon the game. And as such, the team had to optimize the area quite heavily. In fact, Minagawa-san goes on to state that it was so bad at one point halfway through that he wondered whether they should just scrap the idea entirely and just move on to something else. From a player's perspective, I can completely understand why they wanted to make the Hideaway detailed and intricate, considering that it's going to be one of the locations you revisit constantly and likely going to be a place where you spend a large portion of your time when playing Final Fantasy XVI. Pressing ahead in the interview, Minagawa-san goes on to confirm that he did indeed of course do the art direction for Final Fantasy XII and worked on Final Fantasy XIV, which is why players can potentially see some similarities to those games in Final Fantasy XVI. Ultimately though, when it came to Final Fantasy XVI, they were initially unsure in regards to the direction that the game should take with its overall look and overall feel. Having the capability to depict larger scales of detail in Final Fantasy XVI, Minagawa-san said that they struggled particularly with characters and their expressions, as they were far more realistic than what they had ever previously worked on. Going beyond just characters, however, apparently including Moogles in the world of Final Fantasy XVI posed a great challenge, specifically because they wanted to find a way to include them that would fit the feel and look of the world. As performance mode apparently alters the polygon count slightly for some of the characters in Final Fantasy XVI, they had to add in some extra post-processing effects specifically for the Moogle, otherwise he would have ended up looking like a hedgehog when playing in performance mode. Moving on to the next question, which deals with a hotly contested topic, maintaining the identity of the Final Fantasy series and how challenging it's been to do so with Final Fantasy XVI. This is a cyclical conversation that comes around every single time we are on the verge or the cusp of a new Final Fantasy, and that is largely because all of the Final Fantasies pretty much differ from each other wildly in regards to the art direction, to the story, to the scenario, to the gameplay. They're all different in some way, and as such, people who are fans of what's come before might not necessarily be fans of what comes next. When tasked with the creation of Final Fantasy XVI, Naoki Yoshida went to talk to Hironobu Sakaguchi, who of course is the creator, or the so-called father, so to speak, of the Final Fantasy series, and Yoshinori Kitase, who has worked on many a beloved Final Fantasy title, who both essentially told Yoshida-san the same thing. That Final Fantasy, at its core, is whatever the director making the latest installment thinks is the best game and the best story at that time. If the director goes on to create a game with those points in mind, then it is a Final Fantasy, full stop. There's no need to feel constrained by what has come before. And in a follow-up question, the team is asked, did you feel the weight of expectation from fans, considering Final Fantasy is obviously a series with a very passionate fanbase, and if so, how did it affect you? To which we get quite an apt response, if I'm honest. The Final Fantasy fanbase isn't just made up of fans of the entire series. I'd say that a lot of passionate fans are passionate about specific titles in the series. For example, someone might love Final Fantasy VII, while someone else is all about Final Fantasy IX, and yet another person thinks Final Fantasy XII is the absolute best. All of these people have different expectations and hopes for what they want in a Final Fantasy game. There are some who think it has to be turn-based, and there are those fans that also may think, well, recent Final Fantasy games seem a bit retro and outdated, I just don't find myself playing them these days. Our decision to make Final Fantasy XVI a real-time action game means that there will probably be some fans who decide to give the series another go, and there will be some people who will say it's not a Final Fantasy if it's turn-based. And with that, it's just not possible to fulfill everyone's expectations in just a single game. He then rounds out his answer by stating that he hopes future developers of Final Fantasy can look back at 16 and look at the real-time action aspect of it and think of it as a valid Final Fantasy as well, and ultimately have more freedom in whatever game they're going to create. Keeping in mind what Sakaguchi and Kitase said about what it takes to make a Final Fantasy game, and Yoshida-san's answer in regards to turn-based versus action and the whole ordeal with Final Fantasy XVI, I personally think he's hit the nail on the head there, in that Final Fantasy is constantly changing. It's always in a state of flux. Titles are wildly differing or varying from each other, and just with the nature of things, you might resonate with some titles more than you might with others. And you might not like where the series is at or potentially where it's going, but just because that may be the case, doesn't necessarily make it less of a Final Fantasy, and it's certainly not worth chastising people for if they like a particular title. I know, however, that of course not everybody will agree with that statement or agree with my own personal thoughts on the matter, so definitely let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments section below. I look forward to revisiting this topic in 7 years when the next Final Fantasy is on the horizon. Finishing off this video on a more positive note, however, apparently one of the largest challenges the team faced in Final Fantasy XVI was just the sheer volume of content. Content, of course, which I myself, amongst many of you, also cannot wait to absolutely get stuck into. There really isn't that much time left until Final Fantasy XVI is finally within our grasp. And with all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.